Hello, and welcome to the Scott Mize Show, a podcast focused on health, diet, bodybuilding, and philosophy. I interview experts, doctors, coaches, and N=1 case studies to answer your questions about improving health, achieving your best physique, and making sustainable progress. We'll cover topics from carnivore and ketogenic diets to bodybuilding to life philosophy and everything in between. Enjoy the show. Are you looking to lose fat, gain muscle, or improve your health, or all of the above? Interested in working with me one-on-one? Stop spinning your wheels, because I offer personalized coaching where I can help you reach your goals, whether it be fat loss, muscle building, improving your health, or all of the above. I provide tailored nutrition, training, and supplementation advice, one or all of them together, with 24/7 ongoing support to help guide you every step of the way. You can email me at scott.mize@gmail.com. Click the link in the description of this episode to schedule your free consult call to go over your goals, answer questions with no obligation. Let's take your physique or health journey to the next level. This episode is brought to you by LMNT Electrolytes. This month, we're switching it up with an exclusive offer that's only for VIP LMNT partners, including Carnivore Cast listeners. You can now receive this free sample pack along with any regular purchase when you use my custom link, which is provided in the show notes or my Instagram link in bio. That's drinklmnt.com/carnivorecast, all one word. And as I said, I'll include the link in the show notes. LMNT Electrolytes are convenient, evidence-based, and delicious. And get yours today to help support the show. Thank you. Soon to be Dr. Zac Robinson is a researcher in exercise science and the founder of Data Driven Strength. Zac has an MS in exercise science and is a certified strength and conditioning specialist. He is currently a graduate research assistant at Florida Atlantic University's Muscle Physiology Lab. He recently published a preprint exploring the dose-response relationship with proximity to failure, strength gain, and muscle hypertrophy. Welcome to the show, Zac.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it, man.
Yeah. So I'd love to just start with your background and how you got into exercise science to begin with.
Sure. So classic story, was interested in sports in high school. So I think that's where most exercise science kind of stories kind of start. Thought I was going to go down the kind of more traditional, either physical therapy or medical school kind of path initially, but then I kind of got into strength conditioning late high school to trying to improve sports performance for myself kind of in late high school. So I was like, okay, strength conditioning sounds like a viable option as well. Went to undergrad at Ohio State University with that kind of thinking in mind. Through my time at Ohio State, I think I kind of shadowed or had the mindset of going through kind of every single one of the typical exercise science paths you could do. So I shadowed kind of a cardiac rehab exercise physiologist position. Didn't really like that. Kind of had a talk in one of my classes about everything that's required for physical therapy school and all the logistics associated with that. Wasn't super interested in that. I actually talked to somebody about this was later when I was in the program about doing an MD PhD. And that was going to be a absolute nightmare of working for a couple of years, getting out of school, taking a bunch of extra classes. So I wasn't interested in that. Yeah. And then I had tried research once before, and the lab dynamic and everything just wasn't a great fit for me initially. So I kind of scratched that off too. So then I was really unsure what I was going to do, honestly. And then one of my friends ended up volunteering in another lab at Ohio State that she was just honestly looking for something to kind of build her resume. And I was like, all right, yeah, I'll give this a shot as well. And ended up doing that with her, the mentor of that lab, and just the overall lab dynamic was absolutely awesome. And just a really, really good introduction to research and kind of what that can be in a positive light. And absolutely got me hooked. Honestly, was a pretty different topic than what I research now. We were predominantly focused on exercise psychology, behavior change, things like that. So some more, I would say, kind of mainstream issues that are really interesting. And I got to help out a bunch of projects related to exercise in cancer, exercise in knee osteoarthritis, those kind of things, which is really, really good experience for me. Kind of came in as, I'm obviously a resistance training guy now, but thought I knew a lot more than I really did. And that was a very humbling experience and got a lot of real world application with those kind of populations and learned a lot and learned a ton of what I didn't know, which kind of encouraged me to kind of keep on going with graduate school and research and stuff. And I really liked it. Did my master's at Florida Atlantic University with Dr. Michael Zordos, which I think people that kind of interested in this kind of stuff are familiar with.
Yep.
He's a really, really good mentor as well. And ultimately ended up staying for my PhD here as well to kind of continue some of the work that we were doing there. So that has been the long, hallowed path to me. Almost done with this. And yeah, probably aged more than my biological age would show on the inside.
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
not. Maybe it shows. I don't know.
I almost did a PhD actually, in a very different field, but yeah,
What field?
ultimately organizational behavior. So kind of like the psychology of business, like how to
Sweet.
motivate people at work, what makes a good manager, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I tried to publish a paper. I did an original study and tried to publish a paper my senior year and just learned how like much of a slog that was.
Absolutely.
And then like a couple professors were like, yeah, for every study I do, I like write 12 different papers and submit them to at least 20 different journals each and like
Oh
all
man,
this stuff. And I was like,
you're gonna get me going on a tangent on this. But
yeah, I
yeah,
was like, I
hopefully,
don't know if this is for me.
yeah, hopefully those things are changing. There's a lot
Yeah.
of pushes in kind of modern science practices. One, there was a huge Twitter thread that I was reading the other day actually that I was talking about something very similar to what you're kind of mentioning here is just like
Yeah.
journal formatting. That is like an insane level
Yeah.
of time and work that people put into that, which is basically
Yeah.
an unnecessary it's just an unnecessary amount of work that's required to format
Interesting.
things for different journals. And that's just, yeah,
Yeah.
hopefully those things are changing as we go along.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm sure the initial introduction to that kind of logistical process was not a fun
Yeah.
thing. They get you really hyped up.
Yeah. It was cool to publish an original study or to,
Yeah.
yeah, publish an original study. But yeah, it was interesting. I think I would have loved it actually. I sometimes really wish I had done it. Um, so what do you study or like what have you concentrated on in your PhD?
Sure.
And how did you decide to cover the topic of training effort and proximity to failure?
Yeah. So I came to FAU kind of for my master's in particular, really interested in the topic of proximity to failure. We did a project which was my master's thesis that I'm still working on getting all written up and all that kind of stuff, which has been a long process. So hopefully that's coming out here relatively soon. That kind of was the initial part of that process, and in performing that study, designing it, ultimately writing it for the graduation of my master's, and kind of learning about that research. Um, I just had a lot of ideas and things we wanted to explore or related to that. So the meta analysis kind of came out of that process, and everyone in the lab kind of talking about that and just how that seems to be a training variable that kind of underlies and interacts with pretty much everything that we think matters. So I think it's a really important variable, just kind of as far as training prescription goes. So that's how I kind of got interested in it. And the meta analysis was kind of supposed to be the final hurrah with that topic, and has just recently obviously come out. So it's been a long time since I started working on that initially, and I actually started that before my PhD. But my PhD in particular is actually looking at the methods and ultimately kind of like the yeah, I guess the methodology of studying individualization of resistance training. So kind of a pretty hard pivot from what I was doing in my master's. I think you've caught me mid data collection and after a long day, so I might sound a little bit more pessimistic than normal. But I think this project, this topic, and my awesome committee that has pushed my understanding of what we can and cannot know about this topic has been extremely eye opening, and I've had a lot of my personal beliefs broken and learned just a lot of things about what we can and can't say about individualization and really how difficult it is to study. And so that's the big project that I'm doing right now is kind of this design that's kind of necessary to study that, and it's been an eye-opening experience just to know how difficult it is to perform a study that's investigating that topic. Specifically,
Okay.
I'm looking at the individual response to training volume. That is probably the most supported variable if we're going to see it in a training variable, that people do indeed respond in a way that we can pick up on it with appropriate statistical methods. Volume is probably the thing we would expect. So that's the variable that I focused on for my actual dissertation project. So we're in the middle of that, and also working on a review paper related to that. That's a little bit more kind of methodology and statistics
Interesting.
based, kind of associated with that. So spent a lot of time thinking about that, and just thinking about, do individuals respond actually fundamentally differently to mechanical loading, or
Mm.
is this related to a bunch of different noise in the system that is kind of created in kind of our research ecosystem that we generally perform studies in, is kind of the genesis of my project, and what I'm trying to kind of pin down to the best of my ability, which there's a lot more to be done. I guess I'll put it at that.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So how do you design a study to test, like, is it like testing the efficacy of individualization?
So not necessarily. So I guess the first part, there's kind of two components to what I'm interested in. The first is trying to rigorously test, do individuals actually respond differently to different training protocols,
Oh, okay.
which sounds simple, right? We have a lot of field experience. We
Yeah.
look at some of these, I would call them, studies that create observations. So, like, there's a couple data sets that people like to point to, including myself, before I knew more about this, that show a really, really wide variation in response to like a standardized training program. But
Yeah.
there's a few kind of leaps there that would kind of lead somebody to saying people do indeed respond individually to training.
Mm.
Even looking at a common training design in a lot of training studies where people have one limb performing one program, one limb performing the other program, and seeing that some individuals tend to observe higher change scores in one condition versus the other, whereas other
Yeah.
people seem to be the opposite. Kind of a basic example of the thing that we're trying to tease out is, let's say you ran the exact same training program 10 times in a row, right?
Yeah.
There's the obvious limitation in the kind of context of resistance training is that you have the time component there that you would kind of expect diminishing returns over time
Yeah.
regardless. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, performing that exact same training program 10 times in a row, there's kind of going to be a natural amount of variable fluctuation that's going to
Yeah.
occur in response to that exact same training stimulus.
Mm.
So when we compare that difference to A versus B, we have
Yeah.
to keep that noise in mind. And so
Right.
basically what you have to do with the study design there is you have to deliberately measure that noise, which comes from the repeated training intervention. So basically, we're having people perform one training intervention, washout period, come back, do it again. You're able to quantify that noise, and then you're able on the individual level to
Mm.
contextualize those between protocol differences to see
Interesting.
if it actually exceeds the noise.
Got it.
That's ultimately the study design that's probably required to do it the most robustly. But when you realize the sample sizes and things that are kind of required to do that at the most rigorous level, it becomes really challenging. And so that's kind of component A, and then component B, which, if we do see kind of meaningful individual variation, even on the participant level, then the next question is, from a coaching perspective, is can we predict that? So we took a ton of different baseline measurements, all kinds of different stuff that coaches could have access to that are relatively ecologically valid, to say, if I have this participant come to me on day one, could we take any of these baseline assessments to be able to semi-accurately predict which protocol they would respond favorably to if that response variation does seem to exist? So kind of part A versus part B. That's kind of the
Interesting.
broad the
Got it.
broad interest in my topic,
Cool.
which, like I said, it's been a very eye-opening
Yeah.
kind of journey about what we can and can't say, what I thought I knew.
Sure.
It just was not a whole lot at this point.
So would it be, so this is me just nerding out on this stuff, but
Mhm.
would it be like, to test the first thing, you have like participants either do 10 sets of bicep curls or 20 sets of bicep curls in each arm, and then you see one person, like, say you have two participants, Sally and Jane. Sally gets way more growth from 10 sets, Jane gets way more from 20 sets.
then you wash out, then you repeat it. And if they just switch by the same amount or like over many, many more data points, then you can kind of assume it's just due to noise that they
Just
responded
yeah,
differently.
so, yeah, exactly. It's
Okay,
that's the concept basically.
got it.
Is that when we have on the participant level, they each individual is going to have some degree of noise that they exhibit to the same
Yeah,
training stimulus. Then you're
yeah,
contextualizing that noise against the between protocol difference on that
got it.
participant level. And
Interesting.
so if that difference, even though it could be relatively visual on like a plot, right? Like if they
Yeah,
have two data points, so the change score from condition A to condition B, you can see
yeah,
a nice positive trend
yeah,
for condition A versus condition B. If you have no contextualization of that component of noise, which is called within participant variance, then we really have no way of knowing if that actual difference is a
interesting.
true variation ultimately.
Yeah, it
So
sounds
it's
very complicated statistically.
yeah, I've learned a lot. My committee's been really, really good, and I'm ultimately happy that I embarked on this journey because I've learned a ton along the way. But man, it's been
Yeah,
breaking a lot of barriers of things that I thought I knew and things beliefs I held on starting this process, and so
interesting.
it's been cool.
Cool. So going back to the training effort and proximity to failure paper, what I'd love to do is start with like what were some of the main findings and then talk about the methods after. And then
Sure.
maybe after that, we can talk about like ways in which it's been quote unquote controversial or
Yeah,
misinterpreted.
for sure. Yeah, so I think the findings are relatively straightforward in terms of the things that I like um, to mention. First thing on the front end here, as you already mentioned, is a preprint. I'm currently undergoing the kind of modifications that we've got a ton of good feedback on the paper. For the most part, I think the general concepts are going to remain the same, but there are definitely a few things, finer nuances and things that'll change. As far as the overall findings, which I think are kind of the main concepts that I wish were stressed, kind of when this paper got disseminated, was that we were looking at the overall directionality of these dose response relationships for the different training adaptations. Looking for strength, which is relatively straightforward. When you include load, which is the percentage of 1RM, on the bar that an individual is using, proximity to failure essentially has no impact on strength gains. So the load is the driving factor there when you're looking at a predictive factor for strength gains. If you think about the principle of specificity, we're ultimately trying to mimic that. And as you perform more reps in a set and get closer to failure, you're actually losing force production. And that's kind of my working model on why things kind of seem to play out that way. The load or the absolute or the relative percentage of 1RM on the bar is going to be the thing that kind of determines that force cap that an individual is producing for that set. And that seems to kind of be the most explanatory factor for strength gains rather than proximity to failure. So if you want a set to be hard for strength, we'd rather that to be because the bar is really heavy rather than because you're accumulating a bunch of fatigue within a set. That's for strength. Now, for hypertrophy, it's basically the exact opposite. There was a relationship in which gains in muscle size tended to improve as we got closer to failure. I think the major piece of interpretation I think I've learned a lot about kind of how to communicate this is I think people definitely read into the actual dose response relationship curve a bit too much. Ultimately, the fit of these overall models is pretty poor. Like we included the way the volume was equated, load, intervention duration, training status, and proximity to failure in these models, and they're still explaining a relatively small amount of the variation in the effects that we observe. So that's important to keep in mind. That said, we still saw positives or slopes that favored closer proximities to failure. So to me, when I look at and interpret these results, that's the takeaway: is that there does seem to be a stimulus as we get closer to failure. The exact way that that curve looks, for a variety of reasons, I don't read into a ton. We basically had to, like you said, we'll get into the methods, but it's always I have a hard time not mentioning this on the front end is the RARs in the paper were estimated. We had to, in order to perform the analysis that we wanted to perform, we basically had to go through all these studies and estimate those RARs. So even if the RAR estimations are off a little bit, the exact way that curve can bend and jump and all those kind of things can ultimately change a decent amount, right? So I think the overall relationship is going to be relatively stable. Like I think our methods and everything are going to potentially be off a little bit, but I think they're kind of consistently off. That makes sense, such that I believe the overall slope and trend that we saw, that changes in muscle size will tend to improve as we get closer to failure is kind of a safe bet. Whereas ultimately, the exact curve, the exponential increase towards failure, and some of the models that we saw seem to fit pretty well are all things that I think can get potentially overinterpreted. So again, just to recap, for strength, at a fixed load or percentage of 1RM, RIR really doesn't seem to be predictive of strength gains at all. Whereas for hypertrophy, it seems to be a pretty important factor such that as you get closer to failure, changes in muscle size seem to improve.
Got it. Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. I think those caveats are super important because people immediately see like data and they're like, okay, this is exactly what it means. This is a fact. Let me like draw lines and chart things based on it.
Right.
You know, so talk about the methods. How did you arrive at aggregating these studies and estimating the RIRs and ultimately getting to the regression?
Yep. So ultimately, kind of all the meta-analyses on this topic have basically had to compare failure versus non-failure, and that's kind of like a binary categorical comparison. There's been the most recent meta-analysis, which is a really good job that kind of incorporates the different failure definitions, has also been done, which does kind of an additional layer, but ultimately it's still that categorical comparison. The thing we were interested in estimating was the dose-response relationship and kind of understanding this on a more conceptual basis and being able to plot the entire relationship along the RIR continuum. That's kind of was our goal. And so in order to do that, we basically needed to have RIR as a continuous variable for every single study that we thought met our inclusion criteria. And so if you go into those individual studies, I think less than 5 of them actually report either subjective or objective RIR based on velocity. So we had to go through procedures of estimation to ultimately make these work. So we basically took the best available citations that met the population, the exercise, the loading range, the concentric intended velocity, those kind of things, to try to match those up the best with each of these individual studies. And then we used a series of equations and procedures to estimate the maximum possible repetitions an individual could perform with a given load, subtract how many they actually did, and out pops your estimated RIR. And those are for kind of a bunch of different kind of categories of studies that all kind of, led to slightly different procedures to estimate the RIR for each one of those different buckets. But ultimately, that was kind of the general procedure. And so the thing I always say kind of on the front end is just as like a general premise, like if somebody doesn't accept our way that we went about estimating the RIR, they could take issue with the overall findings, which is a totally reasonable critique. Personally, obviously, I try to set things up in the most sensible way that I thought I could, and I think they do a relatively good job of approximating just when I read the study how close to failure do I think these individuals probably were on average. But of course, we don't really know; we just don't have that data. So it's quite literally the best analysis that we could do. But in 20 years, when we have a bunch of studies that are appropriately reporting RIR, taking that into consideration and actually have a bunch of robust data where that reporting is sufficient and we're not estimating anything, then these analysis could look substantially different. So that's just an important thing to keep in mind when talking about those estimations and things like that. That's just kind of the initial premise you kind of need to even get off the ground before we go through the rest of the limitations and methods and everything.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And one thing I found interesting is that you pulled in other studies, like the studies with cluster sets. Can you talk a little bit about that?
For sure. Yeah. So I think if I recall off the top of my head, the kind of the couple buckets of studies that we included, obviously we included the failure, non-failure studies that are kind of designed for that research question. We included the velocity loss research. So just to conceptualize what that is, throughout a set, as you get closer to failure, the bar speed is actually going to slow down. And so you can use that as an approximation for the proximity to failure. There's been some published equations that can kind of use the load that they used and the velocity loss achieved to kind of roughly approximate RIR. So we included those. We included studies that obviously directly reported RIR, and there's a few of those. And then we also included, as you mentioned, the research that uses alternative set structures, which those kind of fall into 2 different categories: cluster sets or rest redistribution, both of which are ultimately using rest intervals to manipulate the proximity to failure of a given number of repetitions or or so. So one group performs 3 sets of 10, the other group may perform 6 sets of 5, or they may perform 2 reps with mini rest intervals in between every single one of those 2 reps, still getting the same total of 30 reps. Those obviously can be looked at as kind of a separate category of studies. But to me, when we're kind of trying to perform this overall analysis in studies that directly or indirectly manipulate proximity to failure, I think that kind of adds some more firepower to this analysis where we may see kind of additional effects kind of pop up. So I think that's another good area of research that we try to incorporate this just to try to get as many effects as possible, because we're already, working with a pretty small amount of studies, particularly for hypertrophy.
Yeah. Do you think, one thing I was thinking when I've heard you explain this in the past is that cluster training inherently is going to have shorter rest times. So even if you were doing like with your 5 RM, or that's a bad example for hypertrophy, but with your 10 RM, you're doing like sets of 6 with 20 seconds rest, 30 seconds rest, whatever. Inherently, those sets are going to quote unquote perform worse on hypertrophy because they're shorter in rest, based on the research we have on shorter versus longer rest times. So would that kind of inherently make training short of failure look less effective if you included cluster sets that way?
It's an interesting question. I guess to me, generally the rest interval research, to my knowledge, those sets are taken to failure most of the time.
Yeah.
So the thing that would potentially be of worry there would be, okay, if I'm taking 3 sets to failure and I'm taking 1 minute versus 3 minute rest between those sets, my performance is probably going to decline way more in the 1 minute condition versus the 3 minute condition. Whereas with cluster sets and rest redistribution, ultimately what you're doing is you're making a given amount of work easier, not harder. So if anything, I get from the performance aspect, at least, I think it would be able to maintain performance better. And we have some data that would show that, although if proximity to failure is important, those additional rest intervals are basically delaying the inevitable that you would want to achieve, basically. So that's the theory of us including it, was that you're basically manipulating proximity to failure in that case by the introduction or removal of a rest interval rather than either the repetitions or the load, which is what you're doing in the other cases. So
I guess it would depend on how the cluster training study equated for volume.
Yep.
Exactly. That would make a big difference too, theoretically.
Yep.
Interesting. And you mentioned the velocity loss research, and you mentioned earlier working with Dr. Zordos. I heard you too on a podcast talking about this paper. So obviously he seems incredibly supportive and very intellectually honest. But I'm curious if his work and writings in mass about how, based on some of velocity loss data, he was developing this kind of hypothesis that you can train much further from failure and still get really good hypertrophy, if not equal. Did that influence you at all when you were thinking about this, or like how did that work?
I think we had a relatively similar read on the research for the most part. The two things that I think, I'm going to speak for Dr. Zordos here. Obviously, I could be wrong. We've had many conversations about this. I don't think I am wrong, but I'm going to I think he makes 2 kind of assumptions when he's talking on this topic for the most part. So in his mind, he's fighting against the claim that you must train to failure to optimize hypertrophy in every single parameter, situation, outcome, which I don't think is accurate. Specifically, in his mind, what I think, when generally speaking, when he's talking about this topic, he's thinking multi-joint exercises, relatively heavy loads, both of which the preprint analysis kind of demonstrated that RAR doesn't seem to matter nearly as much. So in those conditions, I think he's he's pretty spot on. So the couple studies that have tended to show that you can train substantially farther than failure and still kind of do all right in the hypertrophy department have been kind of on the moderate to heavier load end of things. And I do think that tends to matter when we kind of aggregate all these studies together. That's where we can start kind of picking up on some of those additional trends. And specifically when we kind of think about the motor unit relationship or the at least the assumed mechanism of kind of how this stuff works. You basically have to make a set hard, and if it's already really hard when you start the set, or sufficiently challenging, like one rep at 85% of your 1RM is already like 5 RER, right? So when we're using those kind of loads upwards of like a 10, 8 RM, I think that's where RER seems to be come less of an issue in terms of hypertrophy outcomes. I still think it probably, if we were to have a a super big study that's never going to get done, I think it probably still favors conditions training closer to failure a little bit based on just the data that we have. But I don't think it's nearly as a clear cut scenario than maybe some of the lighter loads, purely based on our analysis. Now, obviously, again, all the caveats, limitations that we've already mentioned in mind, a new study that actually looks at this question appropriately, quantifies RAR directly, et cetera, could, look at a high and low load group and disprove that. So that's where I'm not entirely sure. But that would be kind of my implicit premise in kind of thinking and explaining his kind of observations on this topic, is that I think he's fighting against the statement that you need to train to failure in every single scenario to optimize hypertrophy, where I also don't think that's actually true. I just think that on a per set basis, the stimulus is probably maximized very close to failure, if not all the way. But that doesn't mean you can't create a scenario where the differences become relatively negligible. And I think with you're using heavy loads, maximal intended velocity, equating the repetition volume that you would achieve otherwise, I think those are some things you can do in your favor to equalize the conditions out than compared to a condition training much closer to failure.
And can you talk a little bit about why you think this paper has been controversial in the industry, and you've already mentioned some of them, but some of the big ways that it's been misinterpreted?
For sure. Yeah. I think ultimately the biggest thing is just directly, excuse me, directly interpreting kind of the differences in RAR and the exact difference in effect size and things like that. I think obviously that there's a part of the analysis that obviously suggests that to some degree, but the actual the goal of the analysis was just to demonstrate the directionality of these adaptations. Honestly, the main thing I was interested in starting this was strength, just because I had done a reading of that research, and I think the story for strength was just a little bit different than something that I kind of had in my brain of what I ultimately thought was what we were going to find, which was pretty similar to what we ultimately found. And if anything, on hypertrophy, I was more on the end of, you're probably going to see similar outcomes, 2-3 reps from failure than versus failure, but there's some nuances into the statistical approach that ultimately leads to an outcome that's potentially slightly counterintuitive to people. But ultimately, I think that what you take away from this analysis is the overall directionality of the relationships for strength. RER doesn't seem to matter a whole lot once the load is fixed, and for hypertrophy, it seems to matter, a decent amount. Obviously, like I said, we're not explaining all of resistance training outcomes purely based on RER, but the slopes seem to be relatively meaningful. It seems to be an important factor to strongly consider when you're designing a hypertrophy program, thus making that decision and counting for all the different variables that go into writing a training program, making sure proximity to failure is scaled appropriately with that, I think is something that's important. Does this, let's go through the couple things of interpretation that I think are not correct. Does this mean you should take every set to failure? Absolutely not. I think there's a lot of ways that even if you just view it from a conceptual basis of if we have a degree of an effect size that we're trying to combine sets to get to, not every single one of them has to be, to failure, obviously. Are there scenarios where training to failure is just logistically a better idea than others? Absolutely. If you're training bench press by yourself, probably not a great idea. Things like that I think that are very easy to make sound bites and say that you should, take this and absolutely run with it. And all the other meta-analyses on this topic were wrong. Personally, I think if you kind of go back and look at all the ones that have been done to this point, pretty much all the effect sizes kind of lean in favor of the closer to failure condition. It just wasn't It just wasn't consistent enough to reach a statistical significance threshold. But we're dealing with a small number of studies with low number of participants. That's basically kind of the status quo in our field. And that effect size still isn't relatively large, but they all do kind of lean in that direction. So I think I wasn't particularly like shocked by it by any means. Like, to me, once again, I guess I'm reading it from the perspective of what I'm supposed to take away from this, in that on average, the directionality is that hypertrophy seems to improve as we take sets closer to failure. And that's pretty much where I stop. I don't tend to like interpret things super finely and like comparing RERs and things like that, just because I think we're a long ways away from being able to do that finally. And like we already talked about, due to the fact these are all estimated RERs, things like that, you just got to be really cautious what we're doing. I think ultimately the data set and the analysis is good enough to give us that overall directionality of the adaptation, but I wouldn't overinterpret things from there. If anything, from like a qualitative perspective, I think this has shifted my opinion a little bit, just to kind of sit my general RAR range of that program for hypertrophy a little bit closer to failure, feature more sets to failure on average, things like that. But I don't think this has completely changed the game. Do I always program sets to failure now at this point? Absolutely not. And I think coming back to kind of what I'm really interested in terms of individualization, this has me thinking a lot about ultimately what are the factors that lead to observations on the individual level from people in the trenches of, I'm really pro failure, I'm really in the RAR camp. And I always try to take the mindset that both those people are probably right and they're probably doing what's best for them over time. But to me, the thing that's interesting is what is the actual thing that's leading to one of those two approaches being better for an individual, if that's actually the case. One thing I kind of keep in mind is kind of like a rough potential explanation is that if somebody was to perform a given amount of volume, performing all their sets to failure, but then they perform a similar load scheme, all those kind of things with more of an RIR approach, if their performance is drastically, like the volume load they accumulate over a session is drastically higher in the RER condition, maybe training to failure on that exercise and that condition for that individual isn't a great idea.
Interesting.
I think another thing I like to think about with this too is that I think people tend to view the proximity to failure thing kind of on a not granular enough. Like, the way that I view it is like, for the most part, I think when people have this conversation, they have hack squats for moderate to high reps in their mind for some reason.
Yeah.
But for me, at least, I can take, my back work. I'm just getting over an illness, so I apologize for the listeners.
Oh, no problem.
I'm really trying
You're
to
fine.
hold it together here and not be annoying. But for my back training, I can take a set to failure, or even to the point where I can't even perform a lengthened partial after that.
Yeah.
And I can repeat very close to my rep targets after like a 2-3 minute rest.
Yeah, like a machine row or something.
Yeah.
No
So I
deal.
think that's an example where the cost of failure, being the kind of the fatigue that's coming from a set like that, doesn't seem to be there. So for me, the kind of the trade-off, or I mean the consideration of why you may not want to go to failure from everything we kind of understand and believe on this topic, doesn't really seem to be there. Whereas, for somebody's lower body training, or maybe there's just substantially different than me, maybe my back's just really small and I can't generate fatigue, something like that, and they see a meaningful drop in performance after a set to failure, maybe that's an example where an RIR approach makes a lot more sense. So it's just, that's kind of what I'm interested in now at this point, is like, what is that underlying factor that's ultimately going to predict which of these two approaches is going to be better for an individual, if that's the case. But on average, if we're kind of just painting this general kind of textbook relationship of what does proximity to failure mean for hypertrophy, it seems to be relatively meaningfully related, such that hypertrophy improves as we get closer to failure. But that's basically where I stop.
Yeah, it's really interesting. One of the last things you mentioned, like thinking about rep drop off as a measure of like how fatiguing something is. It'd be really interesting. I know this is probably impossible in a research setting, but to see how well using rep drop off to like determine someone's volume and training intensity would be, in how effective that would be. Like if you said like, oh, this person, when they train to failure on legs, their reps drop off way too much.
Yep.
So they can do RIR training for legs versus other body parts it doesn't. And this person, when they add sets, the rep drop off is so dramatic. So don't add more sets for them, and vice versa. It'd be really interesting to see like how effective that is as like a model for hypertrophy.
I hope it matters. That's one of the things I'll be looking at with my dissertation. For volume particularly, but I hope it matters at least.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One thing, I was listening to you on the Revive Stronger podcast, and one point that Dr. Mike was making, and I think a lot of other people have made about the paper, is that the relationship, the dose response relationship with proximity to failure and hypertrophy seems to become less significant when you look at advanced trainees, higher frequencies, higher volumes, males. I'm asking you to speculate here. Do you think this is mostly a problem of statistical power and the overall relationship probably still holds? Or do you think that training effort doesn't have that relationship with hypertrophy in those populations or those circumstances?
It's tough. I mean, I think the uncertainty intervals on all of those estimates are extremely wide. They're already extremely wide for the main models.
Yeah.
So speculating too much on that
is
oh man, I'm so sorry. My dog's going nuts.
It's fine.
Is probably not wise.
Yeah.
That said, I would assume that the relationship, again, on a per set basis, kind of exists throughout.
Yeah.
But I think there are absolutely more than one ways to kind of reach an absolute amount of stimulus, if that makes sense. So that is my current working hypothesis, and that, again, on a per set basis, probably training to failure is probably going to maximize the stimulus.
Yeah.
But if you are looking to compensate with more volume, looking to compensate with more frequency potentially, maybe you're an individual who performance drops off a ton. Are trained individuals able to get more from lower RIRs due to more neuromuscular efficiency, things like this?
Yeah.
I think those are all reasonable hypotheses. We just have to get more direct evidence on these, particularly with good RIR reporting that performs all the adequate methods for me to make a strong stance on that. But I think they're all reasonable. And I think, again, I think purely from a practical perspective, the way that I view it is that I don't think that training to failure is necessary to optimize hypertrophy. It just, on a per set basis, may be an efficient way to do so. But
a little bit better.
But if that limits for an individual how many sets you can tolerate, there may be a kind of problem of optimization there. That doesn't allow us to tolerate the total, number of sets that are going to optimize hypertrophy for an individual, such that that little decline in per set RER on average may make sense for that person. Now that we got studies suggesting there potentially are positive outcomes up to 52 sets a week. I don't know if you saw that recent chatter on that paper. Man, who knows? 52 sets to failure sounds pretty brutal. So, I think that's ultimately the way that I view it, is that per set basis, understanding this relationship is important because it allows you to create that optimization game around these other variables, volume included, and all the kind of things that you mentioned. But particularly from the paper, man, those intervals are pretty wide. So I tend to not have a ton of super a ton of stock in there. More than interesting, something to keep in mind, and kind of maybe potentially rely on field level experience in there where we don't have like an exact examination of that question in particular.
And those intervals are wide just due to the nature of there being little data.
So it's to some of them the observations are lower. Some of them the variable like the actual data variability is just extremely high. Like, for example, the load one's a bad example, but that's the one I'm going to use. If there's not a very clear relationship there, the variability in the intervals increases. So that you're just kind of dealing with all those things. Basically, there wasn't any super clear patterns there to kind of make anything out. Whether that's due to a decrease in number of data points or the spread of those data points, both are going to contribute to kind of the increased size of the intervals of those estimates that we're kind of working with and working on. So more work to do ultimately.
Yep. Yep. Really interesting. Well, thanks so much for your time today, Zac. This has been awesome to chat with you. Really appreciate you taking the time with me after a long day of data collection.
No worries, man. I appreciate it. You got me to talk about the individualization stuff a little bit, which I don't get to talk about a ton. So that was cool.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I'm definitely looking forward to more of your findings there as they come out. Where can folks find you and follow along with you?
Yeah, man, you can find most of my stuff on Instagram, just Zac.data-driven strength. You can find all of our stuff there. And then also data-driven strength on YouTube. We've been posting some videos as of late. And I'm going to get flamed in the comments. My voice is
No, you're good.
terrible. But yeah, man, thanks. This was a great chat. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And
likewise.
you can find my stuff there.
Thank you, Zac. Thank you for listening to the show. You can find The Scott Mize Show on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Please leave a comment, like, review, or share the podcast with your friends or followers. It helps more people find the show.